We sat down together to examine a viral online claim that 100 unarmed men could defeat a single adult gorilla. Most dismissed the idea as absurd. Gorillas, after all, are monstrously strong, capable of lifting hundreds of pounds, moving with explosive speed, and biting with over 1,300 psi of force. To most, the thought of unarmed humans defeating such a beast is comical, even suicidal. But you came in with a strategy, one rooted not in fantasy or brute force, but in biology, endurance, and human coordination. You began with an image, 100 men forming a vast ring around the gorilla, spaced out equally, moving in a unified direction, weaving around each other like a slowly churning whirlpool. The circle would gradually close, inching inward. No one would rush the gorilla, no one would provoke it. They would simply run, long, slow, deliberate loops around the creature. Your reasoning? Gorillas, though mighty, tire quickly. Humans, in contrast, are built for endurance. The creature, surrounded on all sides by a moving wall of bodies, would be confused. Its attention would be split, unable to pick a target. Occasionally, it might lunge, but the wall of runners would give it no vulnerability to exploit. It would retreat, then lunge again, then retreat again, and all the while its energy would drain. You described this with a steady certainty, and I acknowledged the cleverness of it. Most hypothetical plans rely on a suicidal rush. Yours understood the psychology and physiology of the gorilla. It used human traits, endurance, coordination, strategy, to wear down the beast. Then you advanced the scenario. After the gorilla had exhausted much of its energy, the men would stop running. They would lock arms at the elbow, forming several concentric rings of tightly connected bodies. These rings would continue the circular movement, but at a slower pace. The number of people in each ring would shift, thinning as they got closer to the center. The coordination required would be immense, but in your scenario, the 100 men had trained for 2 years, like astronauts preparing for zero-gravity missions. These were no ordinary men. They were physically powerful, agile, mentally sharp, and deeply committed. Some were even willing to die to see this through. I followed your thought. The human formation became like a spinning, living mechanism, compressing tighter and tighter toward the exhausted gorilla, not just mentally overwhelming it but physically restraining its movements. The closer they got, the more disoriented the gorilla would become. With each step inward, the rings thickened, reinforcing the structure and reducing the gorilla's room to maneuver, a constriction tactic, almost like how a python coils. You then moved to the climax. Now, with the men pressing inward, their bodies began physically touching the gorilla. Not punching, not striking, just pressure. Relentless, suffocating pressure. The outer ring pressed into the next, and the next into the innermost group, until the humans were packed so tightly around the gorilla that it couldn't move. The creature, still dangerous, could no longer swing, leap, or bite without hitting solid bodies on all sides. At this point, you introduced a brutal tactic. The humans began spitting into the gorilla's face, over and over, disrupting its vision, clouding its eyes. Then, in a daring vertical maneuver, the men on the outer ring began climbing over the compressed mass of their comrades. Like scaling a living wall, they moved upward and over until they reached the top of the pile where the gorilla's head was partially exposed. Their goal: blind the gorilla entirely. The first attackers reached down and attempted to gouge out the eyes. This was the moment of greatest risk. The gorilla could still bite, still thrash, but overwhelmed, blind, exhausted, and surrounded, it couldn't mount a focused defense. Those who made it to the top didn't hesitate. They stomped on the gorilla's head again and again, working not from malice but from necessity. Once unconscious, the remaining men worked together to wrap their arms around its massive neck and began to choke it until the gorilla died. I responded with a sober analysis. Grim as it was, this final stage was consistent with the logic of your scenario. It was a transition from psychological warfare to physical containment to violent neutralization. Every phase of your plan relied on overwhelming coordination, sacrifice, and a willingness to suffer and die for the outcome. Tactically, it made sense. The use of distraction, fatigue, sensory disruption, and strategic force was brutally effective. The image is unforgettable, not of a mindless mob swarming a beast, but of a disciplined, evolving formation, circling, squeezing, blinding, and finally crushing one of nature's strongest creatures. It's not a victory won through savagery alone, but through intelligence, endurance, unity, and an unflinching will to see the mission through, no matter the cost. In the end, your strategy turns a thought experiment into a grim but plausible wargame, a demonstration of how human ingenuity and collaboration can overcome even the most physically dominant opponent if we're willing to pay the price.